So they created the Life Story Network.
Yep.
And then they went through and they started writing the information they took from families, and they started asking questions other than just basic obituary information. They started asking questions about the person's life from the moment they were born, how they interacted with their parents as a child, how they interacted with their children or their brothers and sisters, and then they would talk about what they did in school, what they did after they got out of high school, if they went to the military, if they went to college, where they met their spouse and what their first experience was and their first day and how they decided to get married and when their children came along and their employment and their volunteerism, their church group. And so then what they did, they took that information and then they were able to create this entire life story, because everyone has a story from birth until death. What happens is that they take the creative designers take the words from the life story and they put the photos to kind of correspond with that, but then they also bring a part of the era of when we're talking in that portion of the life story
great.
And putting in there. Like this lady, Mrs. DeCharon, she was actually from Indonesia. Well, when the Japanese came in and was persecuting, they had to leave and they fled to the Netherlands. When they're actually going through and showing the DVD, you have the words, you have the photos of her at that age, but then what you see is actual black and white World War II fighter planes and battleships. So then when they're in the Netherlands, the Germans came through and they actually started persecuting, so they fled to the United States. And then as you're reading that, you see a world antique globe turning and it lands on the United States.
So you created like a multimedia.
Yeah, they do. And that's what the Life Story does, is they create the multimedia and we do printing and stuff, and then we share that during the actual visitation and funeral. And you and I know people in the part of our life that we actually meet them and interact with them. But we know nothing about their past.
Yeah.
And we may not know anything about their future for a while because we may be disconnected or moved, but then we get reacquainted. So this life story actually teaches and shares every part, not every part, but a huge amount of parts of the person's life from birth till death. I have family members after the funeral's over with that will actually come and talk with me and say, you know what? I've known my family for 40 years. I didn't know my uncle did that.
Yes, exactly.
I just learned something, and recently my uncle died, and we did the life story for him. And I helped my aunt accumulate things, and I asked her for questions. My uncle had a little diary that he'd written about some things in the military over the last year or so. And I said to my aunt, I said, I didn't know he smoked. I didn't know he sang. I didn't know he did those things, because when I was born, he was 40 years old. I had no reason to know those first 40 things. I heard bits and pieces throughout my life, but I really didn't pay attention. So when I actually ended up helping her write that life story, I learned about his whole life from his birth to his death.
So how did you learn? How do you get trained to do this kind of multimedia, the writing that goes with it, the choreography almost?
Right, what we do when we actually sit down with funeral families and make the funeral arrangements, I have a kind of a template, I use paper or it's in my head, and I just start asking questions, and the questions start opening up the family, and then the wife will tell me a story, and then the children will tell me a story. Brothers and sisters, if they're here, they'll share some things about it. So as the specific questions that I ask, and the life story provides those for us, and we kind of use those, and then you just kind of learn to pull things from families, because they may say something about like they like to play the piano. Well, I can just leave it as they play the piano, or I can say, well, tell me, where'd you play the piano? Then they share, they may have played the piano in a symphony somewhere.
Yeah.
And then we can kind of expound upon that and bring that in. And so we do that, and then I go through and take that information that I glean from the family, and I put them in little bullet point notes. And then I send them off to Life Story Network in Portage, and they have writers who actually create the written life story. And then the families will go through, and I kind of explain to them about photos. I ask them to bring in about 20, 25 photos. And then I take them and kind of put them in order with a family, and we talk about them, and I say, now who's with him? And then I go through, and I put them from birth until death. Then I upload them in my computer, send them down to the Life Story Network, and then they have actually creative designers who pull this all together. And we can do this typically within 24 hours or 48 hours.